Okay, we're here with Ed Newbigin, who's a plant biologist with 30 years of experience at the School of Biosciences at the University of Melbourne. He's an expert on cellular and molecular biology of plants, and in specifically aerobiology, which, Ed, I presume is about biological things that float about in the air.
That's right, Jess. It's great being here and talking to you about these things. So aerobiology is about the stuff that floats around in the air. At a scientific level, I'm interested in how some of these things, pollen particularly, gets from one plant to the other and how one plant perceives that pollen as part of their reproductive process. But in the context of what we're talking about here and talking to Asthma Australia, I'm also interested in pollen as it's perceived by the human body and how it triggers allergies and so on. What types of pollen is in the air and how does it interact with the human body to bring about asthma and hay fever.
So, Ed, what are some of the common types of plants that people with asthma might have problems with in their backyard?
Grass is the obvious one. And if you're someone who doesn't cut their lawn regularly, that can be a problem. But often it's going to be the trees. It can be the ones on your own property or on the street or on your neighbour's property. And I'm thinking here about some of the European trees. So these are the deciduous ones, the ones that lose their leaves over winter time, and particularly things like birch and ash tree, and the elm trees and so on. So many people have got a birch tree or two in their front yard. They can be a problem. Also, I think cypress. Cypress can be a bit of a problem for some people. Cypress are wonderful trees to have, great sculptural elements in the garden, but they do release a lot of pollen. Here in Victoria, cypress pollen is by far the most dominant pollen type that we see, and it can cause allergies.
So does that mean native Australian plants are better for allergy sufferers?
Often, but not always. So a lot of the Australian grasses are much lower allergy than the imported grasses that we have, which cause problems. So things like perennial ryegrass, which is a widely used pasture grass, is a real problem. But some of the Australian grasses, the native grasses, are less of a problem. They don't produce anywhere near as much pollen as these other grasses, the pasture grasses and so on. So I'm thinking here of Microlenus dapoides, which is being used more widely now as a grass for a lawn grass. That's quite a good one. So you can make sensible choices about the types of plants or the types of plants you use and have low pollen producing alternatives.
So to make sensible choices about the plants we use, what are some of the rules of thumb for choosing plants for around the home?
The ones to avoid are the plants that are wind pollinated. So if it's a plant which has non-obvious flowers, they're what we would call cryptic flowers, they're not showy flowers, they're the ones probably to avoid. So birch plants are a good example. The flowers are fairly innocuous looking. You probably wouldn't notice them at the time, but they're releasing an awful lot of pollen into the air when they're flowering. And they're things to avoid. Things which have got nice showy flowers, which are probably the ones you want to choose anyway, they're going to be less of a problem because that pollen is being carried from plant to plant by pollinators, birds and bees and so on.
So the show is all about attracting the pollinator.
The show is all about getting someone to pay attention to me and visit me, and then I might give them a little reward, a sip of sugar, some nectar and so on, and then they'll go off and visit another flower nearby on another tree and carry that pollen along with them. If they're not bothering to do that, if they're not got those obvious signs of come and visit me, come and pay attention to me, then they're probably plants which are throwing their pollen, vast amounts of pollen into the air, and they're going to be a problem.
Are there low pollen varieties of plants, or are there plants that have different presentations that could be a better choice for someone with allergies?
Yeah, there are lots of choices. There are lots of things you can look for. There are often sterile varieties of plants. So there's a couple of different ways a plant can be sterile. So it can be sterile because it's a mule. It's a cross between two different species of plants, and it's not viable in the same way that a mule is crossed between a horse and a donkey is not viable. So some of those plants are quite good. They're usually pretty productive, but they can't produce pollen at all. There are other ways of being sterile. So there are some plants which are quite fine as females. Most plants are both male and female in the same organism. So there are some plants which are viable as females, that is, that they can produce fruits, but they're not viable as males. So they're male sterile plants. And there are some grasses around which are like that, which are also a good choice. They don't produce any pollen at all. So you can talk to your horticultural expert or go down to the garden shop, and there are good selections of plants you can choose which will be sterile plants.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned fruit, because a lot of us have fruit trees because we like the produce.
Sure.
So obviously flowering is a key part of growing the actual fruiting body. What
Yep.
advice do you have about fruit trees and allergies?
Generally, fruit trees are pretty good, although there's one plant I will mention, that's the olive. Unfortunately, it's pretty common in a lot of people's gardens to have an olive tree or two. And the pollen, it's a wind-pollinated plant, and its pollen is highly allergenic, and you also can be allergic to ash pollen. So ash is a European tree, which is related to olive. Across Europe, people from Spain, because there's a lot of olive orchards in Spain and Italy and Greece and so on, people have olive pollen allergies because there's just such a lot of olive pollen around. And then when they go to Northern Europe, which is where the ash trees grow, they pick up an ash allergy as well. So if you've had exposure in Europe and you come to Australia, that olive tree sitting in your corner might be giving you a few problems, and you might also have an ash pollen problem as well. So that's a particular problem where we don't think of olives as a fruit because it's not sweet, but it is a fruit, so that's one to look out for. Generally, fruit trees are okay, but and it's the nut trees which are ones to look out for. The nut trees are often wind pollinated, but not too many people have those trees in their backyard. But things like walnuts and pecans and so on can cause allergy problems. But generally, you have an orchard and you'd know about those allergy problems.
In choosing plants to put in your backyard and even around your house, does it make a lot of difference for people with asthma? Is it a controlling factor?
If you've got plants that are a trigger for you, then that's going to be a big problem. But obviously pollen travels further. It's not held out by the fact that you've got a fence up around you. So it will come in from neighbouring properties fairly easily. So particularly the tree pollens and so on. If you've got your bedroom, and right outside your bedroom you've got a birch tree and you're a birch tree allergic person, that's birch pollen is a bad thing for you. Or if you've got an elm tree or an ash tree or something like that, then those are things which might be causing you problems late at night, especially on a hot night when you've thrown the windows open to get a bit of air through, and suddenly you've got some pollen coming in, and that means you're triggering your asthma. So things to look out for would be some of those trees which are sitting in your garden close by to windows.
Are there any great resources for people who want to learn more about designing their garden for asthma and allergy?
Yeah, there are some great resources around. Asthma Australia has got a low allergy garden information available, and I think you can also go talk to your down at the garden supply shop and talk to them about some of the plants which might be more appropriate for you. They're especially talking about plants which might not produce pollen, so these are things which are sterile for various reasons, or that have got showier flowers rather than plants which don't produce flowers at all, or have less obvious flowers, the wind-pollinated plants.
So Ed, you're involved with Melbourne Pollen, which is looking at pollen counts across Victoria, isn't it? It's statewide.
Right. Mm.
So tell us a bit about that.
Melbourne Pollen's been going for a long time now. It started back in the early 90s by Professor Bruce Knox, and I took it over in 1998, and I've been running it ever since. So running a single trap site at Melbourne University for a fair long time, and providing that information out to the public, and they've found value from that. But our real moment in the sun came in 2016 with the thunderstorm asthma episode that happened in Victoria on November 21st of 2016, when a lot of people were affected because of their allergy to grass pollen. And we had that high grass pollen day and a thunderstorm, and then thousands of people were affected, and we tragically had 10 deaths as a result of that particular event. So since then, we've been working with the Department of Health here, the State Department of Health and the Bureau of Meteorology to produce a thunderstorm asthma forecasting service, and that's now been in operation for a number of years, so since 2017. So that's been great, and that has meant that we've broadened the number of pollen monitoring sites in Victoria from the one that I was running. Now we've got 8 sites running across Victoria, so it's been really great, and people across rural parts of Victoria really appreciating the fact that they've got the same information in their places that we've got in Melbourne.
So what are the plans to go national with that?
Oh, well, we've got all sorts of plans, and money's the big issue there. We know an awful lot about what triggers people's allergies in Melbourne and across Victoria, and that's obviously the grass pollen. If you live in Melbourne and you drive towards the South Australian border, you're going past an awful lot of sheep pasture, and that sheep pasture is all perennial ryegrass and things like that. So that's why grass pollen is such a big problem here. It's a little bit less clear what are the triggers for asthma and what those major triggers are elsewhere, but we're certainly looking at it, and we've got a team of great collaborators. So we've got people up in Brisbane and in Sydney and in Canberra, people down in Tasmania as well, and in Adelaide, who are working on doing pollen counts and trying to understand what the major allergic pollen types are in each city. In Melbourne, it's really grass is the main one, but we need to figure out what the pollen types, the bad pollen types are elsewhere in Australia, and those are the ones that we'll be forecasting in the future. So work in progress, but that's where we're aiming.